Have for you today. We are celebrating today many of them many of them are here, including Professor Narlikar, who I see in the audience, and so what we normally do is to celebrate the Foundation Day nowadays in two stages. On the day of the event, we have the Foundation Day talk, and I'll talk about a speaker in a moment. And then the following day, or the previous day, we have the associated cultural event and various events that happen within IUCAA, done by people who are part of IUCAA. And that's going to happen tomorrow, this year. So this Foundation Day talk has been going on from the very beginning. The very first talk was given by Professor Govind Swarup back in 1989, I think. And then since then, we've had the tradition of this Foundation Day talk has been to have a very eclectic collection of important speakers who talk about a variety of issues. So we try not to have a talk on astronomy and physics every time. So we've had, for example, talks that have been purely academic from various disciplines. We've had Michael Berry and Gerard de Hooft and Rudam Narasimha, Abhay Ashtekar, Ashok Sen, and prominent physicists give these talks in the past. We've had talks on science and education policy by Professor Yashpal, who was one of the people who was responsible for setting up this center, T.V. Ramakrishnan, Suma Chitnis. We've had talks about social causes and the general environment, our causes, our concern for the environment. We've had Vandana Shiva give a wonderful talk. Very recently, a lot of us remember Madhav Gadgil's talk, which is very, very well attended. And then we have people talk about public policy issues. Ashish Nandi's talk, people would remember. So it's a very broad range. And last year, on the 30th anniversary of IUCAA, we had a very special event in which you remember Professor Satish Shetty talking about the physics of the Indian monsoon, along with we had, because it was also the 80th birthday of Professor Jayant Narlikar, birthday year, we premiered the film version of the production that Sai Paranjape had made as a tribute to Professor Narlikar. And in this auditorium, just before the Foundation Day talk, we premiered that film. So that was a wonderful occasion. So this following up, then today, we are so privileged to have Professor K. VijayRaghavan, who is currently the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India, to talk about a very, very interesting and very general topic, and he's called it Manthan. And Professor VijayRaghavan is, as you know, a fellow of the Royal Society. There aren't many of those in India nowadays. And he, of course, before this was the Secretary of the Department of Biotechnology and also Acting Secretary to the Department of Science and Technology as well, and is very well known as the Director of the National Center for Biological Sciences, NCBS, as part of TIFR in Bangalore for many years, setting up this amazing institute in Bangalore. He is, of course, not many people know, is a chemical engineer from IIT Kanpur, and then moving into molecular biology, doing a PhD from TIFR, and then working in Caltech for several years as a postdoc, and then came back to India, to TIFR, and then was instrumental setting up NCBS, and he's actually been part of very, very important decision-making processes ever since in his various roles. He was awarded the Padma Shri in 2013 and the Infosys Prize in 2009, and of course has another litany of prizes. I'm not going to go into all that. I give you Professor VijayRaghavan and leave the stage to him.
Can we switch off or silent our mobiles, please, in the meanwhile? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Shomak. It's really a great pleasure and an honor to be here, particularly to see Professor Narlikar in the audience. Obaid Siddiqui, Govind Swarup, B.M. Udgankar, Jayant Narlikar were all our heroes as we were growing up in TIFR, as were also the crowd in mathematics and computer science. And truly, that set of people, the mathematicians, the computer scientists, the astronomers, the biologists, have had an extraordinary impact on both India and in the world. And I think their story is something which needs to be told in a very, to communicate it as a collective to a broad audience. So it's a great pleasure to be here. It's also, I'm coming today, as I was getting ready for this talk and coming here, it was increasingly clear in my mind that I was perhaps an imposter in this audience. Before I came for the lecture, I went and discussed with Shomak on the way here, and then with your, communication and outreach teams and the new, group which is being head by Sakya, and any doubts which I had about being an imposter were completely dispelled. So there's really nothing of significance which I have to tell this astronomy audience. My only hope is that there are others here who are not astronomers or data scientists, and there are perhaps others who might see the recording and who might find a naive and simple talk interesting. So, first of all, I'd like to thank Shomak and his colleagues for, discussing with me the history of Indian astronomy over the past few years, and that was something very valuable for me. It refreshed a lot of memories. I learned about the contributions of from Aryabhatta on to the Kerala school, but also it gave me a chance to look up what happened subsequently, Jay saying the Mughals, and current astronomy, all the telescopes we have in over here, near here in Narayangaon, in Ooty, and Hanle, and so on and so forth. And that's a picture of our telescope in Hanle. So, it's pretty amazing what India has contributed, and Indian scientists today continue to contribute in astronomy and astrophysics. So I'd like to, first of all, congratulate you, and also all the wonderful outreach which is going on here. Let me start with the end. And our story today ends with historians of the future. They used to be called astrologers. Today they call historians of the future, warning us of the dark paths we have taken. And these portents come with evidence. It's not just speculation. And the argument they give is that we, i.e. those who have wielded power and wealth, these historians say, have snatched nature's dice from nature. Nature rolls out its dice every moment, and for some time now, we have loaded these dice in what we think is in our favor. With some luck and some ingenuity and some guile, we have got the power, because of this loaded dice, to explore nature's engineering. The mysteries of Prithvi, Jal, Vayu, Akash, and Agni, earth, oceans, air, the skies, and energy, were seemingly ours for the asking, for us to understand. And in doing so, in trying to understand nature's engineering, we have become extraordinary engineers of nature. As a consequence of this, and I'll probably refer to this a little bit in my talk, we as stewards of this planet are faced with a challenge for sustainable development for all humans, while conserving our biodiversity, our environment, and dealing with the consequences of climate change. In this already difficult landscape, a new and mighty power has emerged, developed and controlled by a few, promising to serve the many and rescue us all. Will it take us all and the planet to a new and bright future? Or will it create a dehumanized dystopia, is the question that historians of the future debate. What is this new power which has emerged, which we ourselves have created? That is called artificial intelligence. And across the world, large corporations and governments collect data and use this information, make data into information and knowledge, and use that for making decisions. This is not new. This has been going on for thousands of years. Today, they all do it really rapidly. And they do it well, perhaps. They do it comprehensively. Knowledge has always been the key that opens the door to power. But today, fewer and fewer people share that key. Yet the lives of more and more than ever before will be impacted by those who have this key. So even more interestingly, the master key may not be with humans anymore. So in this situation of this epilogue, let's wake up now. All of that was a nightmare. And we wake up to our present reality to ask what will really happen. How far into the future can these historians of the future really see, and how ominous are the real outcomes? Now, this is a messy topic, and it is ever changing, like much of our lives and much of science. And the talk will try to answer these questions and suggest that the answers are actually not complex, they're simple. They're complicated to execute, but what we must do is simple, and it's also within our grasp. So that is the Manthan, how the promises and perils of the churning of data can be understood by us, and what future it holds by us. These pictures, again, taken by Dorje Angshuk from the Indian Institute for Astrophysics, and this is Phogat Lake in Zanskar, Ladakh. He's a terrific photographer, as is the photographer at the neighboring GMRT. Yashwant gave this to me. And this is the GMRT telescope. Now let's go to the first part of the talk and try to understand computing. There are three components which I'll try to address. One is computing, the other is data, which is used in computing, and the third is us. What are we doing with all of this, and how we ourselves are potentially changing ourselves enormously. So again, for computing, let's focus on artificial intelligence, and let us ask, what is artificial intelligence? Alan Turing was also a long-distance runner amongst many other accomplishments. He used to run from Benchley to Cambridge or London, depending on whether he wanted to meet his bosses or his peers. And he asked a question, can machines think? And this was Turing's paper on computing machinery and intelligence in 1950. And from that came the subsequent Turing test, which established the fundamental goal and vision of artificial intelligence, which is to ask if there's an interrogator and there are people, or ostensibly people, and what tests will you ask them to prove that one of them or more of them are not people but machines masquerading as people? AI answers Turing's question, can machines think, in the affirmative, and aims to simulate human intelligence or replicate it in machines. But that question, can machines think, is rather general, and the question is not just can machines think, but what makes machines intelligent? That I was referred to a very beautiful textbook by Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig, who point out there that AI is a study of agents, things sitting inside these machines, that receive percepts from the environment and perform actions. They sense the environment, they receive percepts, and perform actions. Of course, if there are agents sitting inside our head doing that, who drives those agents and so on, and that's a question which I might come to. But really, that allows us to understand better and better Turing's question about can machines think, and about what are the kinds of machines one makes to have machines be able to think rather than pose it as a theoretical problem. That's Ada Lovelace, and that's Babbage's computer, and Turing refers to them in his paper. And in elaborating what is needed for machines to think, Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig say that there are two kinds of things, one what goes inside the machine, and one what it needs to act. That is, machines need to think humanly and think rationally. How does one manage to do that? And secondly, they need to act humanly as well as act rationally. And how does one make them do that? So that is the enormous challenge. Now, there are two ways one can approach this. One can make machines do this in a very narrow way, or one can create a machine which does this in a very general way. And Turing, interestingly, at the end of his book, suggests two ways one can create machines which can think. One is to get them to play chess, or the other is to just put them out in the environment and ask them to learn English and see what happens. Well, even that may not be general AI, but that's getting there. But what is narrow AI? Narrow AI, which is sometimes referred to as weak AI, is a kind of artificial intelligence that can operate in a very limited context. You can, get a machine to do something really, really well, but very, very narrow. And it's focused on performing that task really well. These machines operate under extraordinary constraints and have limitations which even the most basic human intelligences don't have. So that would be narrow AI. And all around us, narrow AI is prevalent. Those of us who accidentally call someone called Srinivasan as Siri know that their computer wakes up and asks you to what question you have. So, hey Siri, my phone is off, will result in a question being asked you to ask a question, and you can answer that question. You can get an answer to the question, and so on. So there's all sorts of software available for telling you where to buy your next meal, to where to shop, and so on. And these are examples of narrow AI. CCTV cameras will process images. That's also an example of narrow AI. Telescopes, will process something very narrow. IBM Watson can beat anyone at chess, or whatever the new IBM computer which beats people is called. So all this is very widely prevalent and used. But narrow AI will have two components. It'll have machine learning and deep learning, which is still narrow. Machine learning will allow artificial intelligence to is a component of artificial intelligence. And while AI would be typically a set of algorithms and trying to mimic human intelligence, machine learning would be one of those kinds of algorithms, and deep learning would be one of those machine learning techniques, which would involve different layers trying to emulate in some manner neural networks in biology and so on. But basically, this layered approach allows you to deal with problems at a deeper level of complexity, handle them faster with less writing of code than would otherwise be needed. So all of this computers can do well. And that is your person trying to crack your ATM, and running away is your ATM. And this person trying to crack the ATM is faced with all sorts of problems, and finally runs and figures out a way of cracking the ATM and taking the money. That's exactly what this cheetah is doing in chasing this antelope. They have very specific goals: one to get away, one to catch, and these kinds of requirements can be programmed in machines of various kinds. Your drones, cracking a safe, cracking an algorithm, cracking a problem in astronomy, in which things are dynamic. So all of this can be done in multiple ways. And this typically is computers are getting better and better at it, and this would be still narrow AI. What is artificial general intelligence? There you're talking about creating a machine with human level intelligence that can be applied to any task, and this is the so-called goal or the holy grail for many AI researchers. And this, of course, is fraught with all sorts of difficulty, and people keep claiming that there are computers which can learn many, many kinds of certain categories of tasks, but computers which can learn everything and do as well as humans are increasingly threatening to be feasible, but are still in the realm of possibility and not in practice. So this is not something which has happened. I show this picture of this primate, non-human primate, shivering in Delhi as a potential for a discussion on general AI, and I might come to that a little later. So there are extraordinary advances in computing, in speed of computing, and in memory, and that has resulted in the growth of AI, weak AI in many different ways, in enormous sets of applications. All of this requires data in a large scale, and that is something which feeds these engines of AI, machine learning in particular, to make them make better and better decisions for us. So data is supposed to be the fodder for AI. It has been called the oil, but as many have pointed out, if you were given a ship of oil, if someone said, I'm not giving you a check, but I'm giving you a ship of oil, it's there in the seas, and it's all yours, you can quite readily find out ways by which you can monitor that, which you can monetize that, sorry. And there are multiple ways you can do that, and people have discussed how that's possible. So whether it's actual fodder, or whether it's oil by the sea, or whether it's gold, or whether it's product of a mine, people do that all the time. When they get the raw material, they're able to trade it and make money. On the other hand, if someone comes to you today, if Yashwant comes to you and says, here are 6 disks, a terabyte each of data from the GMRT, raw data which I've collected, have fun and monetize it, there's a slight problem. Because it's not easy to use that data and monetize it unless it becomes information. And that requires a huge set of steps with people at large, even those who are elites at large, will not readily be able to handle that. Much depends on how that data was collected, was it annotated well or not, when it's being collected, and after that, you need to be able to handle it in special ways. So data is not information. For data to become valuable, data starts off as a jumble of raw facts. Users, people like you all, need to sift through it, interpret it, and organize that data. Only then does it become useful. And it comes in an enormous range of formats, and you need to have interoperability to do it. Images and videos can hold a lot of data, but they do it in one way. Other kinds of data, spectroscopic data comes in another way, so you need to handle all of that. So data analytics, first of all, is a huge area of work, but also it's error-prone. Human interventions are needed and often used, and it also has many subjective components. So to monetize data, to change this oil into wealth, is not easy at all. So information comes from data, and that is a huge, huge area of work, and it's very, very important. Just as data is not information, information is not sufficient. Information needs to be converted to knowledge. And this consistent, organized set of facts, which is information, requires a substantial investment of energy to convert that into knowledge. And that requires work in each area. This is a photograph I took at CERN. In each area, for you to understand the domain very specifically, in addition to being merely able to understand data, for you to convert that data into information and information into knowledge. So there's, again, an enormous investment in energy. So this view that somehow data is there, and there are millions of people pouring in data into the cloud, and others are making money off it, and therefore they should be compensated for that data, needs to be balanced, which is true, it's your data, you need to be compensated for it, needs to be balanced with the ways by which data is actually monetized, so that the actual monetary value of data is put in that context. And just as information is not knowledge, that knowledge is necessary for understanding, and knowledge by itself is not understanding. And understanding is necessary for a reasoned action. And this is, I think a picture from GMRT again, of work which they've done. And this, Yashwant, what is this? This is, and I just took this out yesterday so that it's more local. But this is, as you just noticed, Greek to me and to many of you, except to Yashwant. And so this knowledge going to understanding requires, again, a condensing of the data into a form which specialists can see and also interpret. But much of these kinds of seeing and interpreting has a certain reasonable leeway allowed for unusual things which you can pick out. But for you to pick out something which is really different from what you have seen before and attribute a value to that is a big challenge. That requires taking this knowledge which you see here into understanding, and that understanding comes from your having an appreciation of other contexts and being able to speculate within the rules of your field in a manner which makes you take decisions which are leaps, with seeming leaps of faith, but are actually well-grounded. An example you can see here is Jocelyn Bell as a graduate student with the data which led to the discovery of pulsars. So when data undergoes data analysis, it becomes more relevant and useful. Real-world problems don't have simple solutions. To solve such problems, information from multiple contexts need to be taken, and all of that needs to be put together, and it has to be done today. It's done fast, it is organized in a relevant manner, and it has context-based relevance, and it's an aggregate of multiple sources. So this is not due to the train or some other radio wave activity nearby. All those things have to be looked at. So in addition to collecting data from multiple sources naturally, humans also generate data increasingly. Our transport systems, our health systems, our travel, our agriculture, our energy, all of this data is collected. But even from science, we collect data from diverse sources. So there are significant data collection in the traditional databases, the relational databases we store. Machine-generated data is another source. Real-time data, so time series of data is important. We collect data from sensors here about the temperature of the room, what's happening in your car or refrigerator, and so on. There are financial transaction data, and human interactions and digital services provide data in the form of text, email, messages, and so on. So there's an enormous amount of data which is being generated, which again, just like the detection of pulsars, we would like to make sense of. For example, in scientific literature, there's an enormous volume of scientific data, which is impossible for everyone to read everything. What is important or what is not, we still continue to take decisions about that in a 19th or 20th century manner, but there may be something very interesting if we could look at all the data. How does one interrogate data, make it into information, and then knowledge and understanding, and then take decisions? And that is what intelligence is about. Humans are strange. They interact with each other on scale with no apparent purpose. Large numbers of people sit together and listen to someone spouting something. No other animal will easily do that. Then they get together for certain kinds of purposes which are in the future, which is not very clear what those value of those purposes are. And they plan, they say, I want to get a telescope in Hawaii or the Canary Islands or whatever. Very few animals do that. None plan that way. And then when you go and see something, a painting, for example, your mind goes off from the painting to all sorts of things. You talk about, if you look at a painting by Hussein, then you think about Hussein and his life, and then something else, and the mural you saw at TIFR, and then who you saw next to the mural, and the West Canteen, and what you had over there, and then your life as a graduate student, and so on and so forth. No other animal does that, at least we don't think they do. So we are strange. We have all these abilities. Lots of animals organize themselves socially and do extraordinary things, but very few animals organize. They do that in a narrow way, that sort of narrow AI. I showed you the example, I think, when I showed you narrow AI of a termite hill. That's an example of extraordinary organization to build something exquisite, just as I showed you of the cheetah chasing a deer, an antelope. That's narrow AI, and that's not intelligence. That's extraordinarily well scripted in terms of local interactions resulting to specific outcomes. And this termite hill is absolutely awesome. You look inside it, terrific air conditioning. Everyone's task is very precisely laid out. They know what they're supposed to do. They don't hang out doing something else. And they work there, they get food, they get energy for the hill, and they do wonderful things. On the right is a crazy human's idea of what needs to be done. Looks very similar, but that's driven by one architect and his grand plans, getting thousands of workers together and executing a plan, which again, like here, individual workers may have competence and not an overall comprehension, but there's someone or a set of people who have this overall comprehension and what to do. Here in the termite hill, no one has a comprehension, they have extraordinary competence. And that's the difference between humans and all other planets. Animals. Sorry, planets is a slip at this location. So how did all of this happen? How did intelligence come about? So what is the origin of all this? And that is substantially, our intelligence, is substantially a cause of has been caused by a series of cosmic accidents. About 242 million years ago, there was a major climate change catastrophe, probably due to volcanic eruptions or maybe asteroids hitting the planet. That wiped out animals who were then extant, resulting in the rise of dinosaurs. And then 65 million years ago, an asteroid hit Mexico, created a cloud of dust all over the planet, and wiped the dinosaurs out and allowed the rise of mammals. So that kind of huge changes resulted in the rise of the mammalian radiation. And here at the Indian Statistical Institute is a dinosaur skeleton assembled by Pamela Robinson, who came from the University College London to do that many, many years ago. The institute was started by Mahalanobis, a big data scientist of that time, and it's called Barapasaurus tagorei, named after Rabindranath Tagore. I don't know if many of you know that there's a dinosaur named after Tagore. One of the earliest big data scientists in the world, who displayed human intelligence at its peak, were actually these two people, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. 2 days ago in 1835, the voyage of the Beagle started, and Darwin went around looking at big data of all life on the planet. All of us had seen big data. Anyone, you don't have to be Charles Darwin to know that a lizard, if you were to see one in the Galapagos, several meters long, and you saw one in your home, several inches long, you would say, yeah, well, it's possible that they have a relationship. So you don't have to be Darwin to figure out relationships between different kinds of organisms on the planet. Everyone talked about that. Chimps look like us, other monkeys look like us, birds don't, birds look like each other, and so on and so forth. What Darwin did was something absolutely stunning, and Wallace did that in the Malay archipelago, was to say that all life on this planet had a common origin, and through changes which took place over long periods of time, endless forms most beautiful arose. And therefore, this link between all life and their origins, and the way by which these endless forms arose, i.e. by selection, was something Darwin and Wallace did an enormous contribution to our thought. Now, the fact that all life arose from this common origin and are connected has become more and more evident as fact and less as a hypothesis or a theory for a variety of reasons I'll come to. But this is an example of staring at big data, just as astronomers did and came up with the principles of planetary motion. Similarly, Darwin stared at the living world and came up and formulated the rules for natural selection, for how all life came about. What is the way by which this big data arose? Astronomers need to have tools of physics and chemistry to look and understand that, but biologists needed different tools. And those tools came from a small data scientist, Gregor Mendel, who in his garden bred peas and found the rules by which variation within species takes place. How does one pea plant look different from its sibling? How do the peas look different? Those rules were generalized to a variety of organisms, plants and animals, by people such as Thomas Hunt Morgan, who's shown here, Beadle, Bateson, sorry, not Beadle, Beadle came much later, Bateson in Cambridge, and several others. But what Morgan did with his colleagues, Sturtevant and others, was to make a linkage map of all the characters which he saw and proposed that these characters were aligned inside the animal in this manner, on a scale. And there were different scales available. Those on a scale were linked to each other, and those between scales were less linked with each other and therefore segregated differently. And this was just looking at the outside, looking at the shape of wings, the color of the fruit fly's eyes, the shape of its body, and so on and so forth. Then he worked with another colleague, Calvin Bridges, to look inside the animal using a microscope and saw inside that animal chromosomes, which are shown over here in the bottom right. And these were big chromosomes. And then concluded, because X-ray mutagenesis allowed these chromosomes to be distorted in shape, that this line, which is completely an abstraction by looking at the outside, has a physical representation inside the animal. In other words, all these traits which Darwin saw change over time and which Mendel saw change over a shorter time were encoded inside the animal. They were physical and not metaphysical. And these basically somehow, this neo-Darwinian synthesis gave us the rules of how intelligence could be built up. We still don't know how until these people, Watson and Crick, with collaboration from Rosalind Franklin and Maurice Wilkins and others, figured out the structure of DNA, and that structure was so beautiful that it also told us how DNA replicated. It also told us how changes in DNA could result in changes in the animal's form. Those studies came later, but that told us that. So in other words, we know from these pioneering studies how changes in life forms came about in plants and animals, at least at a very reasonably strong descriptive level. The mechanistic understanding continues to be very interesting work in progress. But also, we learned by the integration of this kind of work with those of embryologists who asked, from a fertilized egg, how do you make an entire animal? How, when a cell divides into 2 and 4 and 8 and 16, do you end up in different parts of the body having different features, digits, arms, legs, heart, lung, and so on, and a brain? How does that come about? And they formulated the rules independent of an understanding of this field of genetics. And their approach was to take cells at a 2-cell stage and kill one cell and ask what the other cell and its progeny made, or to take a cell from one location and put it in another and see what happened, and so on. But when they combined, through the work of some extraordinary geneticists, when they combined genetics with this embryology or developmental biology, the rules of how genes are used to make an organism came in place. And when DNA sequencing technology allowed people to sequence DNA from multiple organisms, even those organisms in which you couldn't do genetics, then what Darwin saw came to be seen at the molecular level. All life on Earth is indeed related, and change in DNA does make different forms. But the toolkit to construct a worm or a human is essentially the same. This toolkit is used in different forms to make different parts. You want to make a Cessna, you use the same toolkit in a particular manner. You want to make a Boeing, you use the same toolkit in another manner. But the principles of making an aircraft are basically the same broadly. So this is amazing. Nature is not only conserved in its chemistry, tied by the thread of DNA, but it is conserved by the kinds of mechanisms it uses to make different variations in different kingdoms. All very well. Why are we then different from a chimpanzee significantly? Why do we interact in these strange ways? What makes our brain different? Well, it turns out our intelligence has come about from a variety of accidents through natural selection. Those are simple, have been recounted by several people several times. We can oppose thumb and forefinger. That means I can throw this at you, but I won't. That allows us to make tools, that allows us to use our fingers in a variety of ways which most other animals cannot. That was extraordinary. Our voice box is different. Again, another accident that fed back on the nature of the brain and how that develops. Both these changes physically, externally, allowed internal physical changes. But fundamentally, it appears that we have far, far more neurons, nerve cells, than any other animal on the planet. And we have a disproportionately large number of neurons for our size. Primates, which are our size, have a smaller brain, but importantly, they need to be constantly eating to even support that size of a brain. We don't constantly eat, some of us do now, but when we made these brains, we didn't constantly eat, but we invented fire, which allowed us to pack heavy calorific content into a meal, allowing nutrition to power the growth of the brain and its development. That is at least one theory. That allowed a disproportionate amount of number of neurons to grow for our body size. So we built extraordinary supercomputers and we over-designed them and did them. So these things, opposing thumb and forefinger, the invention of fire, the voice box, a disproportionate brain size, allowed us now to start creating software which could be encoded into this over-designed computer. That allowed the development of language and communication in a manner where the rate of growth, rate of change due to cultural evolution hugely was more than our change due to evolution by natural selection. We were liberated from our bodies because of our ability to make tools, to engineer nature, and to talk to each other, create language, and communicate. We were different, and we are different from that. We know all this in great detail. We now, in some animals, this is a fruit fly from work done in Genelia Farm, Howard Hughes Medical Research Institute in Ashburn, Virginia, USA. We can map in some organisms every single neuron in the adult. We can manipulate each of these neurons. We can activate them or prevent them from being active, and we can see the consequences on behavior. We can watch the animal behave while we manipulate specific neurons. So this gap between the genes, what they construct or what they participate in constructing in cells, the connection between cells and behavior is vanishing. Mendel did enormous discoveries by looking at the outside and understanding without opening up the organism what was inside. Today, we can understand the inner workings of an organism and watch it behave in the outside world in exquisite ways never before imagined. So, what does this mean for us as humans? We have language, we have engineered the planet in extraordinary ways, we communicate, we work together. In other words, we are no longer those objects painted on this canvas of Earth. We are the wielders of the paintbrush. And this was summed up by a philosopher, a neurophilosopher as it were, Dan Dennett, quoting from Macready. Macready built the Gossamer Albatross, which was the first manual aircraft, manually driven aircraft, to fly across the English Channel. And he says that 10,000 years ago, human populations and our livestock and pets was approximately 0.1% of vertebrate biomass. Today, human population, our pets and livestock are 98% of vertebrate biomass. So I don't know the details of this, but multiple other studies, a recent one, more or less confirms this. So over billions of years on a unique sphere, that is Earth, chance has painted a thin covering of life, complex, improbable, wonderful, and fragile. Suddenly, we humans have grown in population, technology, and intelligence to a position of terrible power. We now wield the paintbrush. So we'll come to intelligence and so on again, but our intelligence is changing dramatically, not because our brains are bigger, brighter, or better, but because we have instruments which we have created, which we collaborate with, which we couldn't do ever before, and that allows us to have better and more interesting capacities to do practical things, but also get into abstractions and novel areas of imagination which we didn't think we could go before. So we are now in the Anthropocene, the age where our footprints will be left forever in time. When did that start? So some people say that started at the Trinity site in New Mexico on July 16th, 1945, at 5 hours, 29 minutes, 21 seconds. 16 milliseconds after, this is 16 milliseconds after the proposed start of the Anthropocene. That is the screen waving, it's not the mushroom being active. But another possibility for the date of start of the Anthropocene is slightly earlier. If you ask where the nitrogen in our bodies come from, for most animals and plants over 100 years ago, a little over 100 years ago, we would say they came from natural sources. Plants fixing atmospheric nitrogen in a variety of ways. That led to a rather limited growth of farming and supply of farm products for the growing population. So the growing population explored, nitrite mines all over the world, guano deposits all over the world. None of that was going to suffice. We would have a much smaller fraction of humans on this planet if Haber and Bosch hadn't invented a way by which they could capture nitrogen from the atmosphere and make it into ammonia. Today, most of the nitrogen in each of our bodies comes from the Haber-Bosch process, from fertilizers. So humans have been extraordinary engineers of nature. They have started this perhaps when agriculture started, when livestock farming started, but they have continued this in exponentially more impactful ways again and again, leading to people expressing deep concern about the consequences to larger populations who do not own the means of production, who don't have the wealth. What about their lives? And here is a person discussing this in Manchester in 1931, trying to get people to get together to worry about how the mills in Manchester are making life for the workers difficult. So this industrial revolution led to others and others and others, and we are now at an age where supposedly it's called, I think, Industry 4.0. We'll soon have Industry 5.0. We've had 1G, 2G, 3G. We'll have 5G soon, and soon 6G. So data will be generated at warp speed, will be understood at high speed, and will be used to impact our lives at high speed again. We will be told, as fruit flies in the lab can be told today, what is best for them. And this will come not from some astrology which tries to correlate, what is happening with what the astrologer learned by other kinds of correlations earlier. But this is going to be by handling masses of data in ways which are genuinely personalized in a manner where good advice can come to you. So what's wrong with that? You will be told what's good for you to eat, how you should be healthier, what kind of place you should go to, how to commute, who can help you commute, and so on and so forth, right? So this is something which is supposed to happen soon. And it's happening in various forms already. So in that situation, what are the key questions we should ask for data? And that is simple. What is its provenance? Where does it come from? As citizens, we should ask that. Is it reliable? What are correlations and what are causes? People often make that mistake. Even computers make that mistake. The assumption that by handling data at huge levels, that you can somehow magically reach conclusions and you don't need to have a deep understanding of the discipline is something I'll come to. But how does data help us understand and act if these are the kinds of prevalence? Now, technology has changed our access to data dramatically. Today, data is everywhere and we are in thrall of it. But how can this help us understand the universe and apply our understanding better? So what then are the promises and perils of data? As I said, technology gives us data across scales. As a material scientist, as a high energy physicist, or a social scientist, you can get data extraordinarily fast. But is more better? Some people argue that one needs a better fundamental understanding of the discipline and then go in search of data, but not just have data searches without having a clear understanding or clear hypothesis. But Darwin did that. Darwin went around. He was influenced by various possibilities, but he had an open mind. Others didn't. So what's wrong in looking at data? So there are many examples of the success of big data. Astronomy is an extraordinary success of big data. But have the low-hanging fruit just been picked? And where do we go from here? Now, big data can be incredibly valuable. And those of a certain age who say that, oh, God, this is all terrible. Astronomers don't do that. Astronomers are used to big data for a long time. But many biologists will still complain about how it was great in the good old days when you had a great idea and did an experiment, and now you have to look at all this data, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. So those who mourn the onslaught of big data are just wrong. Now, Sidney Brenner, a famous biologist who died recently, he was an extraordinary thinker, and I don't have time to go on about him. I would love to. But he said that we're thirsting for a theoretical framework to understand big data. And that is the fundamental problem. He's talking about biology, but that's true of many areas where big data is used. And he says that history teaches us that less is better, whereas big data scientists believe that more is better. Least is best, he says. And so we need a theory and a firm grasp of the nature of objects to predict the rest. Now, in other words, where do we go in the quest for data? If I want to understand this microphone and how it works, do I get a microtome and slice it up and do an electron microscopic reconstruction of the microscope? Or is there a more sensible approach to get big data and understand that? So data is not enough. It doesn't speak for the understanding. Generating data is very different from understanding. And to understand this, we must get to the core, which is the right level of abstraction when we want to understand something. But that level of understanding varies from discipline to discipline. What is it, for example, in biology? So the conversion of data into knowledge is a great challenge for the future of all of science and of research. And systems approaches, many people will say, bypasses that. If you understand the system, if you take a holistic approach, you will get an answer for how you go from this level to that level, and therefore you can make decisions. But deriving models of function from the behavior of the entire system is an inverse problem, which theoretically has a fundamental issue. As Brenner points out, very simplistically perhaps in his essay, he says the square root of 4 is 2, but it's also minus 2. And as you go to more and more data, there are many, many, many solutions which are possible which will fit that data. Which ones are right and which ones are not requires a deep understanding, and understanding based on what is the right level to look at. In the brain, for example, he says that you cannot easily escape into holistic ideas, that I will look at how the brain works without going inside. But similarly, you can't go all the time right up to the DNA and say the DNA tells you how the brain works. You must choose the right level of abstraction, and he says that the right level of abstraction in biology in general is the cell. If you understand how the cell is made, if you understand what relationship the cell has to the DNA expression pattern and to the cellular function, how it communicates with other cells, then you have an understanding of biology. But if you collect a mash of brain and you sequence everything there, without this understanding, that useful data which you get from that sequencing of DNA or RNA will be useless without your power of understanding and being anchored in the discipline of cell biology. That's what, this anchoring is what people did when they understood the electrical basis of nerve conduction, discovered the action potential. Hodgkin and Huxley did physiology experiments, set up a theory to predict the existence of ion channels which pump ions from outside to inside and inside to outside and conduct electricity across the nerve cell. Instead, if they had crushed a nerve cell and sequenced all its metabolites, its RNA and its DNA, they would not have understood this fundamental principle. That information is useful today. People are doing that, but they're doing that anchored in neurophysiology. So big data is hugely upon us. It's everywhere, and it'll have to be used in these intelligent ways. Artificial intelligence, many have talked about how it'll disempower us, and the question is, how can we deal with that? And I'll end with that. Here is Yuval Harari. He says, over his 3 books, about where we came from, what kind of a planet we have created, how we are analyzing data, and how dangerously bleak our future is unless we do something about the power we're giving to machines more and more. We will lose all free will. And there will be extraordinarily powerful people who own the data and the artificial intelligence who will do everything that is good for you. Why do you have to worry? That's not what he says, but that's what he says will happen. You will be given your iPad, you'll be given your food, you can watch your TV screen or walk around. You don't have to do anything. We'll feed you and look after you, right? But everything will be done. There'll be engines which will do all sorts of things. That's the dystopian situation. He thinks that earlier introspection and human feeling could break that, but he's very worried now whether that will happen. So when asked in a recent interview, recent meaning about 2 years ago actually, almost, what the solution is, he said that one solution in the days of rising AI will, for each of us, and I would say for groups of us, to have what is called an AI sidekick. Just as big companies own AI and the data and tell you what to do, your AI sidekick will tell you what is good for you. You own the data, or groups of you put that data in. Your AI sidekick runs all the programs and tells you, well, these guys are doing it for that reason. Maybe this is the way to counter that. If you want to be free of that, you can program it that way. Or if you want to listen to that and see what's good or bad. So one needs to have an ability to create these AI sidekicks as a solution. But the point is deeper than that. If there is disempowerment, historically people have always had power when they've had knowledge. But today, that danger is going to be even sharper. Can one have knowledge and power distributed? There, India affords an extraordinary opportunity. While data has a threat of disempowerment, data also is an opportunity for empowerment. Mathematics, statistics, computer science, combined with a deep understanding of some disciplines, of specific chosen disciplines, is something which are extraordinarily popular. We held a coding workshop at the Jawahar Navodaya Vidyalaya in Jafarpur Kalan near Delhi. And these are kids, in a boarding school. They come from, economically poor backgrounds, extraordinarily passionate and, and really thrilled to be able to write code, understand computer science and mathematics. This is something which one can do on an extraordinary scale across the country, and which will have impact very soon. The understanding of what is at the back end in AI and big data is something which is possible in a country this size for people to have in general. And if they don't have it, either as individuals or as groups which are informed, that's going to be very, very bad. So it's something which we as a country, as scientists, as groups of scientists and as institutions need to push very, very strongly. All of this needs to be anchored by the study of particular disciplines, and therefore it's not good to have just this done in the abstract. Of course, if they do this, they will become good hedge fund players, but they can also become good astronomers and biologists and engineers and doctors and so on by this training. Here's another workshop where, some years ago, before this kind of a conversation, kids are making a foldscope designed by Manu Prakash at Stanford, which is less than $1, which has now been distributed to hundreds of thousands of kids. They're uploading data from microscopy from their backyards using this microscope, just as I saw some of the long distance teaching programs where telescope data is being used. So these are extraordinary possibilities to combine astronomy and biology with the study of big data. Aryan Mishra, a kid who grew up in the slums of Bombay, got a scholarship to go to Ashoka University, and he started a company which sets up astronomy labs in schools all over the country. He's doing an incredible job of that. So these possibilities afford routes for empowerment, but time is running out. This needs to be done not in the scale of a few schools, not in a few elite areas, but all over the country. And that is the extraordinary challenge. These are feasible in India today because we have a country where there's extraordinary capacity and talent, and this is distributed all over the country, but is not connected sufficiently to the large groups of our people. That connection can be speedily imparted, and these are the kinds of areas where we'll see global impact very, very soon. So I'd like to end by saying we can use data to empower ourselves. We don't know what the future will be. We can see only a short distance, but we can see plenty there that needs to be done right away. But most importantly, the tools of data, the computers, the telescopes, everything, they're very, very important. They're invaluable. But what lies 6 inches behind that is what is most important. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, I can take questions.
Thank you very much indeed. So this actually is a very broad spectrum, broadband talk that opens up a lot of scope of discussion, questions. It covers a lot of subjects that people are interested in here. So Professor VijayRaghavan has said that over the next half hour or so we have some time. We can take questions. I would
threat or a promise?
Whatever you want to take it as. What we can do is there are microphones dotted around. People are going to take a microphone to you. Raise your hand, and please keep the questions to the topic of today's talk and not stray away from topic. So let's start. Do you have Okay, so let's start from here, right in front. Shanjit.
Yeah. So the picture you drew for the future, that machines are basically producing everything for us, and humans can be fed. If that situation is highly possible, maybe that is what is going to happen. But at that point, what will be the meaning of empowerment? I mean, we need to empower people, but what would be, like, for example, if I can have all the knowledge and I don't have to worry about my food, wouldn't that be some kind of empowerment in that situation? Or do you think it would lead to a disaster?
Right. So that is exactly the dilemma which I'm fine. I'm on. Okay. So that really is the dilemma which people.
Why suppose you need this?
Maybe I didn't turn it on at all.
Yes, now it works. See?
Thank you.
Yeah, good. So you can now.
Yeah. So that is a big question which philosophers pose. What's wrong in that? After all, even today, or even for thousands of years, the wealthy have used their wealth to make time for themselves, to pursue intellectual activities which otherwise people cannot do. That is was a prerogative only of the wealthy, and this new technology will allow everyone to do that. So that is the promise. The fact of the matter is, I would go to what Turing concluded his essay with, which is there are many things to be done today And those kinds of debates of whether that will happen or not is slightly further away. And that is a product of effectively more ubiquitous weak AI, or at least the beginnings of general AI. And while that is happening, countries such as India, which have an enormous population, which have enormous other challenges to lead the world in solving, climate change, biodiversity, the environment, for example, it would be wise to invest in using these to deal with the now and then see what the consequences are for later. Yeah.
I have a question on the termite hill. Do we know that whether the termites know when to stop? I mean, this is regarding the intelligence.
No, so that's a very interesting question. They don't build infinitely, they don't try to build infinitely huge hills. So there are feedback mechanisms from the environment, whether it's a termite building its nest, or birds building their nest, or leaf cutting ants building their nest, about feedback about what is sufficient. But all that feedback mechanisms, which are now being actually understood beautifully by taking out the chemicals which are used in communication between insects and between insects and the environment, we are beginning to decipher and understand. In none of the cases, both by behavioral experiments or by other kinds of experiments, do we see any evidence whatsoever of any planning, central or distributed.
I see.
Right.
Thank you.
People have done very beautiful experiments by looking at the growth of cities and the growth of termite hills, and what are the basic mechanisms, the rules by which they both stop going or slow down. There are some underlying general principles there, but there is no central command in the termite hill, nor are there in many cities, of course. But if you if you destroy parts of a termite hill, there are ways by which it grows, but not exactly the same way, other ways and so on. It's a well-studied area.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, when it comes to... Shall I?
Go ahead.
Just wait. There's one here who's older than
Yeah. When it comes to acquiring data, I think we have reached a state where there are many unethical ways are being used to acquire data. In the sense that, there are pharmaceutical companies who are working in Africa and all, and there are stories how they acquire data without the subject being aware of that their data is being taken. And same is true with our mobiles also. So now, how do you think we can effectively develop an ethical framework for this acquiring of data, and which provides safety to our privacy issues and all?
So this is a problem which has been there for thousands of years, but has scaled in all pervasive ways more recently in an enormous manner. I was dealing with recently about locusts migrating from Iran via Pakistan into parts of Rajasthan and Gujarat. And the question is about how does one figure out what their path is, whether they'll go back, whether the swarms will increase or not. And many years ago, this required close field collaboration between all these countries. That was put in place by the Food and Agriculture Organization, and that collaboration still exists there. But there's feedback on decision-making over there increasingly by satellite imaging of vegetation, climate information which comes in, all of which impacts on their lives of people and whether to spray insecticide or not, but is done without their formal involvement. That's available out there. And this is going to be true of everything, cities, transport. Ola, for example, and Uber have anonymized their data, but that anonymized data in many cities all over the world are available for people to plan. So this invasion of privacy is going to come in every way. It is actually a brief period in the 20th century when it was perhaps lives were more private, but there was no privacy earlier, and there's no privacy now. So what does one do about it is to have a way by which you understand what you're giving. The EU says you can opt out, for example, and opt in. in terms of the data being used. That's a big challenge. You want to disappear from Google, then in theory in the EU, you can opt to do that. But that's not easy in practice, as you know. Tough question.
Yeah, thanks a lot for a nice lecture, Professor. I have one question, like as we know, with the advancement of technology and machine learning and deep learning, so what are the pressing challenges the humanity faces which would be solved by the with the advancement of artificial general intelligence? As we know, before few years ago, a cancer detection mechanism with help of machine learning was solved. It takes now only 2 minutes to detect a cancer, but prior to this, it would take around 4 months to detect cancer. Before machine learning actually took over. So, what are the challenges, pressing challenges, does the humanity faces which can be solved by artificial general intelligence, or a lesser artificial general intelligence which is lesser advanced, or what are the which are the challenges?
Well, let's leave general intelligence aside. That's a more complex and speculative area. But you're right, there are some cancers, some aspects of medical imaging where the volumes of data have allowed machines to learn extremely well and help radiologists or pathologists to take extraordinarily speedy decisions, where their training and their understanding has been invaluable. So that's an area where interesting things will happen. There are many caveats, and I'll come to that if there's time. But look at farming. We have in our country, small and medium-sized landholding farmers across the country. Water, soil, market, weather, these things have extraordinary impact on what happens. You can see ways by which data collection at the fine level, which we were asked about, with due consent, is done so that data from every single kind of farm goes up. There's a learning algorithm with previous year's data to tell people what to do. And this is happening. There's a major collaboration in Africa with FAO, which groups have done to detect pathogens and to give advice to farmers. In the UK, for example, in terms of potato growth, the National Institute for Agricultural Biotechnology has done machine learning with potato crops, and that's really helped potato farmers plan what to do. We collaborated with them a couple of years ago to do that in a project called Farmer Zone. The Department of IT now is extending Farmer Zone to all crops, so that will take off. So farmers will benefit, patients will benefit, transport structures can benefit hugely. So those are extraordinarily positive things to ease all the complexities which we have brought upon ourselves. But whether that will result in other big issues such as climate change, environment, and biodiversity being addressed, that requires more human-oriented action after distilling these kinds of data. And that's more complicated because those are beset by national boundary issues in terms of what different countries do.
So there are two questions in that corner and then this young lady's
So I have a question. While we speak about teaching a machine, will there be a bifurcation further in future that for machines the directives will be more environmental centric, and for humans for teaching in humans more will be in humanity centric? Teaching to machines and teaching to humans will be there will be any bifurcation? And suppose machines are more intelligent and they can perform robots like if they come into existence, and there need to be coordination between humans and robots as well.
Yeah, but let's leave that second part out for a moment. Right now, I am very challenged in coordinating between my phone and myself, let alone the broader issue of control. But the first aspect you mentioned is an important one, that do machines deal with only the more tangible material aspects, and the quote-unquote softer aspects such as literature, music, art, and so on, and what to make of that is what humans can only do and machines cannot do. And that itself is object of interesting research. And there are very nice examples of weak AI being able to do things in these areas which were originally thought not so long ago to be only the realm of human intervention. The lady in front first, we haven't had, and then, yeah.
Sir, my question was that in the life after this, when artificial intelligence comes to life, people won't have to do jobs because artificial intelligence will do all the jobs. So people won't earn. So what will happen to people?
So these kinds of very interesting and futuristic predictions have been around for a long time, that how technology will miraculously save us from our daily chores which we have to do, cleaning a house, buying vegetables, driving from one place to another, all of that will be taken care of and we don't have to do anything. So far, it has never happened. The microwave and your mixie in your home or your car or your refrigerator has not decreased the amount of work we do in our home or in the office, for example. So the point which people are making now, that today it is different. All those were just new technologies, little bits and pieces. This new technology will, some people say, will genuinely do what you're saying. Others say that it is not possible because that kind of machine requires a deeper understanding of how our brain works, of how the human brain works, which we don't have, and it's unlikely that we're going to get that soon. Yet others say that you don't have to understand how the human brain works, but you can build something which functions exactly like the human brain without understanding it. So that debate is still open. So I don't know the answer, but a very good question.
Is this the last question? No. Okay.
Let's see. I mean,
Depends. Depends.
But Mr. Raghavan, thank you for the presentation. In fact, when I was listening to you talk and looking at you, you were reminding me of this guy called David Icke, this crazy guy on YouTube. But anyways,
nice way or a bad way?
I mean, depends. I mean, depends. I mean, if you buy into his thoughts. At some point of the presentation, it was mentioned what happens on the canvas depends on who's holding the paintbrush, right? I mean, you draw whatever you want to draw on the canvas if you're a painter. With all this intelligence that we can gather, I mean, we've always been gathering intelligence, we humans. It's just now we call it data. Where do you see us going in future, right? And who decides what we become? Because even today, in today's generation, today's times, you talk about anything about identity and people jump up with clashes, So who decides on the ethics? Where is man today? Where can he be tomorrow with all this information that he is disposed to?
So this is again an area I'll very briefly.
I know it's a
big topic, but very simply, philosophers who have looked at this, and Yuval Harari is one of them, others have also done that, point out that there was a time when we took our lives and our directions in our lives depending on instructions from above. Then, as our understanding of nature grew, we personalized our ability to take decisions. We understood what is good for us on the basis of our understanding of biology, physics, engineering, and so on. So our decision making became a little more personalized. And today, with the wealth of accurate data and analysis being done, it is possible for you to get information on what you need to do, and therefore you're being depersonalized, right? And this is happening on a large scale. So that is the problem. What is the solution? The solution, again, is, in this slide. The philosophical problem and how to address that is a Californian problem. The Indian problem is dealing with environment, climate change, biodiversity, education, now on a large scale, which democratizes access to knowledge to everyone. The only thing which can protect us against unknown unknowns is our population being extremely well trained and educated. Otherwise, there can be no plan. And that's a plan we must embark on.
Can I wrap up by potentially wrap up by asking a question? Steve, you're standing in there are more, but let me ask my question anyway, and then I'll come back to you. Maybe it's the same question that you're going to ask. But you are in an astronomy institute, and we're talking about large data sets, and you alluded to some of them. Say the Square Kilometre Array, LIGO India, produces potentially some of the largest data sets possible, but only in a very specialized environment, an academic environment, seen to potentially useful to a few. But their models of monetization, of translation into useful, quote unquote, useful data is different from, say, a data set that comes from a cancer database or a database of human behavior. How do you see all this, an academic, purely academic data set, which is very deeply layered in domain knowledge, fit into all this? Because that's going to dominate, that kind of data is going to dominate in some parts of data acquisition.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at our institutions in physics or engineering or, more specifically in astronomy, you have a range of what I call the denominator in the number of people being involved. Some areas, such as engineering, would involve a large number of people. But it is not enriched in the collection and analysis of data and abstraction. It deals with practicalities more, even though it has important components of abstraction and data collection. Other areas, such as biology, have a wider range of data collection and a larger number of biologists, but they're very poorly trained in the analysis of data themselves. They typically outsource that, so that is something that needs to be changed. In institutions of astronomy and astrophysics, we have the other extreme of the problem. People over decades are extremely good at handling big data, but the total number of astronomers, despite the huge amounts of data of quality they collect, is very small. So that's why there needs to be, across the scale, a mechanism by which larger and larger number of people are involved in use of the data, both national data and global data, biology data from protein data banks, from every single paper which is published, and astronomy data should become used by people who handle the raw data, do the data analytics, and go on to do the, get the servers, get access to them and do that. There's a program, by the way, which is anchored in Pune. It's called the Manav Atlas. And that plans to have students all over India read papers in biology, whether they are molecular, cellular, or systems, and then put that summary into a server, which then will eventually be translated. These are papers about humans, every aspect of humans in biology, and that will be translated into creating a human virtual reality where you can go in and see in every organ, every tissue, every cell, what is happening based on the latest science data. So this is a fun project, but it's incredibly valuable. It's at very early stages, but those are the kinds of things we need in astronomy too.
So citizen science is I think, another way to go. That's what you say. Yogesh.
So I had a question about the last few slides that you showed in the talk, where you were talking about taking science to students in India through the software coding projects or the astronomy labs and so on. We have 200 million students in schools in the country. So what is your plan, or what is the government's plan in scaling up these initiatives, which are on small scales right now, so that we reach as many, if not all, the students in the country?
So these are, aspects which, first of all, both formally and in practice, the government cannot and should not do at that scale. There must be a way by which you have exemplary sites and mechanisms by which they can copied and exponentially amplified to reach. That has happened in many areas of our lives over hundreds of years. So it can happen again. But this has to be a movement. It has another component to this. It's not just training in mathematics, statistics, computer science, including coding and so on. But it also requires us to have conversations in our languages about our science, our environment, and so on. So research and this kind of a training should be a demand from people rather than people only demanding a consequence of research. For far too long, because of the way we have isolated ourselves from our people, we are the pepper and they are the salt. And no matter how much water you put on us, we will never mingle. That fundamental change needs to come by crushing ourselves to mingle in a manner where excellence is important. Isolation brings that excellence, but that excellence needs to be more distributed to allow the scaling of knowledge to everyone. It's an enormous challenge to do it everywhere. Last point, forget about India. Do it in Pune, right? With CDAC and with IUCAA and with ISER. Pune has a population of a large European country, right? Transform Pune. Marathas have had an extraordinary impact all over India. Tamilians think they invented sambar, but it came from here, right? So there's an extraordinary potential of doing it well over here. Thank you.
Is that all, or are there any others? There's one in the front. Okay, last two questions, if that's okay.
Please, please.
So I had a suggestion which you can perhaps consider and carry to the government, that all these efforts
they're listening.
Sorry?
No, I said they're listening.
Right. The kind of classroom, demo that you showed during your talk, activities like that would certainly help, and you said it needs to be replicated, at a much larger scale across the country. So yes, all that will help, and it fits into the structure that we have right now. But some other realities that are also attendant to the exploitation of all these changes are that say for example a school student, well, they can attend these lectures, the demos, but that's about it. They are so overloaded with their curriculum, the formal curriculum to start with, that there's no time to venture out and go outside the syllabus at all. So what the government should do, with school students being an example, the other example being, say, unemployed workforce, of which we have a very large number today. Third example being elder care. So if the government puts its mind together and, does some out-of-the-box thinking and makes, policy structural changes that allow, for example, remote working for all jobs in the country, which allows school students to take a break from their curriculum and pursue a project for, say, 1 year, 2 years, and graduate out of school, say 2 years later than their fellow students would. employ those who are out of employment to knock at the door of, say, ISRO, for example, like the person who recently found a Chandrayaan lander having crashed without being an employee of ISRO. So somebody like that. So there should be structural changes across all institutions of the country, across all schools, colleges, that if somebody decides that I want to do this, then he's not bound by the structure. He can make a submission, he can make an application that I have this plan, I want to pursue it for 1 or 2 years, and do whatever it takes. Let me graduate 2 years later. Let me work remotely for X number of hours. Let me take, I'm employed at a certain company, there's somebody ill at my home, so allow me to work part-time. And the government should make laws that force an employer, that force a educational board to allow that.
Yeah, very quickly, there are 3 components. I'll leave out the last third, I'll leave out the first third, but the middle one about having ways by which students can be employed while they're learning in school and college is a brilliant one. I've heard that very rarely, and it's good to hear that. We'll follow up on that. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think we're going to round up tonight. It's been a long evening, and I know there are many other questions, but this can go on for a very long time. We had a very, very wonderful talk, and thank you very much indeed for giving your time to come here. Thanks. So there are some people here who have been told that there is a discussion about the Pune Knowledge Cluster after this, and that's in IUCAA. And if you know who you are, and there is a short discussion, and if you could come outside and identify yourselves, and then we can go on for that. But today this program has ended, and people who are here for tomorrow's the rest of the foundation day, please are asked to come here about 4 o'clock tomorrow, and we have a very different menu of entertainment on the same stage.